Hello, Paul Markham here. I'm just taking my 1959 DKW out for a drive, and today I want to talk about a unique car that very few people would have heard about from the 1930s. It's the 1935 Leichtbau Maier. Let's go. Very beautiful, but going to be hot summer's day here in Perth in the 21st of February, I think we are. Weekend, I always sort of forget dates. Some viewers may know that I write a very modest auto blog that features a lot about cars like this, DKW, two-stroke cars, and Tatras, because obviously I have an interest in those kind of vehicles. And do get a lot of interesting comments, and sometimes people reach out and connect through the blog and send me messages about things. In 2015 I got an email from a Dutch auto historian called Herman van Oldeneel. I hope I pronounced that right. And he was looking into car on behalf of the owner, whose name was Jorg Jansen. He was in Germany, and Jansen had picked up this very unusual car that looked a lot like a Tatra, especially from the rear. Had a long sloping back, louvers over the back window and engine bay, just like in a Tatra. But the front was completely different. Kind of a bulbous, strange looking front with a single headlight that turned with the wheel, the steering wheel. There was virtually no information about this car at all. They'd identified the name as Meyer, and the car was called the Lightweight Maier, number 135. It was a unique prototype, and Van Oldeneel was contacting me because I had a post about the 1933 DKW rear engine prototype, and his research into the engine, because the engine was specified on the build plate of this car, it identified the engine as being a DKW F2 two-cylinder 700cc motor, water-cooled two-stroke, which is the same engine as in my DKW F89P. And that engine was a real workhorse engine for DKW. They used it in their cars, of course, from 1935 right through to 1954. And then if you consider the East Germans, the IFA company, they used it right through to about 1960. They also used it in boats, and they used it in aircraft as well as in industrial purposes like in pumps and tractors, plows, harvester machinery. It was a very, very versatile engine. So this car had this engine. It was rear mounted, it was water cooled, so it had a radiator as well. And Van whether or not this car could have been a descendant from the DKW rear engine prototype. There's very little information about that DKW car, but what we do know about it was that it was a single prototype built to test the concept of rear engines for DKW, because in 1933, 34, 35, rear engines were considered to be very, very cutting-edge development. And many companies attempted it to see if it was a valid solution. DKW built the one car, they tested it on the road, they did some track testing with it, and felt that it didn't improve performance or cost over their existing F-series front-engine cars, so they abandoned it. And that particular car, it was picked up by a race driver who used to contract to the DKW works, race works, and he had it extensively modified and added a front engine in combination with the back engine, so it became a bi-motor four-wheel drive rally car. Very, very ingenious. But yeah, that car disappeared and it had no descendants. So we exchanged a few emails, and I looked into it a little bit, but I couldn't find anything that was really helpful to them. But over time, these guys, Van Oldeneel and Jansen, have slowly put together the story of the Leichtbau Maier. So I'll go back to when it was first discovered by Jansen. It was in 2008, and he was a car enthusiast and collector, and he got told by somebody that there's a really unusual car up for sale at this panel beater's yard. The panel beater's yard needed a little bit of cleaning up. They had a whole pile of vehicles that had been started as projects, and then for various reasons the project had failed, or the owner had lost interest and had abandoned the car. And this was one of those. So the owner of the car had the mechanics do some work on the vehicle to restore it, then lost interest, and then he gave the car away to the panel beaters as, exchange for their work. They could keep the car. It was the intention that they would restore the vehicle themselves and sell it, but after a little while they kind of lost interest in it themselves, because there was no information about this very strange vehicle. So Jansen went over and had a look at it, took off the covers, and realised it was really something quite different to anything he'd ever seen before. When they looked inside the engine bay, they found that it was a Volkswagen engine, and that was a later addition to keep the car on the road, because that engine came from the 1960s. So Jansen tried to find out about the car, and all of his searching came to nothing. There was just no information about this. So he decided to buy it anyway. And after a couple of years of finding nothing to help him, he eventually decided he'll just get the car running and he'll take it to one of the big European motor shows and just put out a call saying, does anyone know anything about this? Can anyone help him? So he took it to the Schloss Dyke big classic show in 2014, and that was where Van Oldeneel was visiting there, and he saw the car, and then he started investigating it. They also had articles in the paper in Germany and elsewhere saying, any information about this car, please reach out to Jansen. Van Oldeneel had done some searching in automotive patents, and he couldn't find, it was very difficult to find stuff, but he found 12 patents in the US patent register, because that had been put online, and he traced it down to a guy called Frederich Maier. And then that seemed to be a likely candidate for as the builder. Meyer, it turns out, was the builder. They eventually found his daughter, who confirmed that the car had been built by him. And it's a really, really interesting story. So Meyer was born in 1898, and he became a pilot during the First World War. After the First World War, he went and did his engineering studies, where he passed top of his class, and then he started working in the aircraft industry. And he worked for Junkers in Dessau, in the eastern side of Germany, and he became one of their leading technical engineers. Worked with them, he toured to South America, he worked over there as a consultant and technical engineer. He also worked in he worked on German auto projects in Russia, because the Germans were banned from building military aircraft under the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So the Germans had a secret trade deal with the Soviet Union, which also included aircraft and tank development. So the Germans would send over engineers who would work on military aircraft and military vehicle projects for the Russians and exchange technology. So he did that for at least a year. In 1929, he moved from Junkers to Albatros, and then in 1931 he decided to set out on his own as a consulting engineer, and he decided he would apply the learnings that he'd made in the aircraft industry to automobile design, and he was very prolific with patenting new designs and technologies, from suspension, front suspension, shock absorbers. He invented the height adjustable driver's seat, but most importantly, he developed a technique for building a self-supporting all-steel car body, which is what we would now call the monocoque concept. Now that was a very rare technology at the time, in the 1930s, because almost everyone was building chassis with a body mounted on top of it, and a lot of bodies were built with wood framing and then steel skin. His patents allowed an entire body to be displaced on the axles, because it was all self-supporting. Used some triangular bracing, a lot like what we would see in things like early aircraft like the Junkers built. Junkers being one of the first aircraft manufacturers to go with all steel construction. And that was at a time when aircraft were generally being built with wood or metal frames, wood, canvas, very small amounts of metal. That was 1931. In 1933, the Nazis come to power, and one of Hitler's first acts is his speech at the 1933 Berlin Motor Show, where he makes the call out to develop a cheap, modern car for the German people. And Meyer recognises that this is a huge opportunity for him to build a car that would demonstrate all these amazing new technologies that he could build very cheaply. So he managed to acquire a sponsor, let's say. So a chemical company or conglomerate out of Munich invested 300,000 Reichsmarks in his business, because he really was a one-man shop. And he built a little bit of a factory and started work on the car. The car he built was quite extraordinary, as I've sort of alluded to. It is a lot like a Tatra. It's very long. Something of a blunt front end. As I said, it has a single headlight that rotated with the steering wheel, so as you turned, the light followed the direction of travel. It had very, very modern suspension with shock absorbers that were inside like telescopic covers. He used a DKW engine, which as I mentioned, placed in the back, and it was all fully steel. Very, very modern car, and it was completed in 1935. He had it on display at the the 1935 Berlin Motor Show, but it didn't get a look in. In 1935, by this stage, the Nazis were already backing the Porsche Volkswagen project. Porsche was making good progress in 1935. At least 3 of his prototypes were up and running and were in testing. So Maier was late to the party, really. This caused a problem for him because his investors were quite annoyed that he wasn't able to get any contract to start building. So they started clamouring to get their money back, which placed him in a great deal of financial pressure. Additionally, he started having legal problems with some other patent holders who also had patents on the self-supporting steel body. A particular company he was having problems with was General Motors, because they had an exclusive licensing arrangement with Opel. Opel being a GM subsidiary, just begun building steel-bodied Opel cars. So he found himself in a little bit of hot water. Some of his patents in Germany were disqualified, which of course caused him a great deal of problems. But he was still a very active consulting engineer, and he has a relationship to this very car, although it's not necessarily a good one, a successful one. In 1938, DKW had settled on the body design for this particular vehicle, which was going to be called the F9 High Class. As part of their strategy of building a modern, low-cost steel car, they had always intended that they would build a self-supporting steel body and dispense with the chassis body, separate chassis, separate body. But when they started looking around to see who could help them with that, they ran into the problem of the exclusive patent that Opel was holding. And Opel would not license that patent to them without very extreme costs. Maier then presented himself and said, I have a separate patent and a separate technique. can do it for you. And he showcased the Lightweight Maier car for them and gave them all details of how his patent would work. Engineers from DKW came and checked it out, and they were very interested. But of course, all these legal problems, all these legal problems that he was having with Opel himself, meant that DKW were afraid to get into a deal with him. So they ended up doing separate chassis, separate body construction, just as they always had done. This car has separate body and chassis, which makes it very easy to restore, easy to separate the two parts. He also consulted for Peugeot in 1939, and they gifted him a Peugeot 202 car as part payment for his work on that. Now I suspect that Peugeot's first post-war car, which was the 203, actually used his patents or the lessons that they had learned from their consultation with Meyer, because the timing fits. So if they were consulting him in 1939, they secretly helped develop that car throughout the 203 through the war, and then it went on sale in 1948, and it was Peugeot's first monocoque construction. So Meyer's history thereafter, and now the war starts in 1939, his history it's very sad and depressing. His business gets commandeered as a military facility, and he is required to repair military vehicles during the course of the war. His workshop is bombed. It's just outside, it's in Berlin, basically, the suburbs of Berlin. It gets bombed twice in 43 and 44. The Maier car gets badly damaged, gets put out in a farm, in a cow shed to protect it, where it pretty much just rots away. Meyer's family leave him, leaving behind in the factory where he lives. When the Russians capture Berlin, he gets arrested, and they recognize him as one of the aircraft engineers who worked in the Russian-German aircraft development program. So he gets sent to Russia to work on the post-war reconstruction. However, he doesn't make it to Russia. He manages to escape from the train that they sent him on, and he makes his way back to Berlin. He struggles then throughout the post-war period to try and get his patents back, because all the patents, not just the ones he had trouble with Opel, but all of his patents are seized by the Allies. So he has no way of recovering any money for his work. The chemical company that loaned him the $300,000 pops its head up again and sues him to try and recover their lost investment. So he has a really quite sad and depressing life, struggling to try and recover his name and to regain his intellectual property rights. Today was supposed to be Classic Cars and Coffee, but because COVID restrictions, we have just the paperwork for events is becoming an extreme burden, and the team who organised this show were given a week to complete a 3-week application process, so the event was cancelled. But I'm still driving. I intended to go out anyway. So Maier's car was eventually, he died in poverty in the 70s. His car was transferred from person to person. It wasn't running, it was a kind of a wreck. And it eventually got sold to a movie company, and they used it as a wreck in a television series in the 70s. But they did want it to be driving, so they pulled out the engine and they stuck a VW engine in the back because that was easy. And then it just sat and languished between owners for many years until it ended up at that paint shop in Germany. Alright, so that's it. It's an amazing vehicle, and it's an amazing and very sad story. And I hope that you like it. Right. And thanks for coming. Till next time.